Wow, that's exciting. Really happy to be here. My name's Heinrich Arnold. I'm with Breaking the Cycle of Violence, an organization. We go around to schools and we share stories of how to counteract problems, violence in our life, and a special tool that you can use that you might not have thought much about. That's called forgiveness. Seems unlikely. Why would we talk about forgiveness? But you'll hear some stories and understand why it's so important. And like Rebecca said, sometimes these stories can trigger strong emotions. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we're all affected by violence. You know, there's so much violence in the world. There's a lot of guns, a lot of gang violence, there's drugs, there's alcohol, many things that wreak havoc in our lives if we let them, if we go down those pathways. But there's ways we can counteract that. And so that's what the stories are about today. But first of all, I want to welcome some other guests here today. I'll introduce the speakers, but very happy to have our District Attorney of Ulster County, Emmanuel Neji. Welcome him. Thank you for coming. And Under Sheriff James Mullen. Thank you for coming, representing the Sheriff's Office. So before I introduce the speakers, let me tell you a little bit how this started. Way back in history, in 1999, there was a tragic event in a high school like this out in California. Columbine High School was the first modern-day school shooting, where two boys who were very disturbed by mental illness, used drugs, had problems, had grudges. They planned this terrible travesty, this event, and they killed a whole bunch of students and teachers. One of those was Christy Bernal. And so that event kind of got this country buzzing. And my father here, his name was Johann Christoph. He was a local writer, author, speaker, pastor, and he was very concerned about this. And what had got him interested in forgiveness was he's also a graduate of Kingston High School, class of 1958. I'm a graduate in 1985. 86 actually was, got ahead of myself there. Anyways, he met Dr. Martin Luther King, the leader of the civil rights movement in the 60s as a student, and learned about forgiveness and nonviolence from him. And then he spent a lot of time in his life collecting stories of forgiveness. So after that school shooting, he was concerned, what can we do to change things in the world? And he got to know a New York City cop, NYPD, Detective Stephen McDonald. Here's a picture of him here. Stephen McDonald was undercover, and he was investigating some burglaries in Central Park back in 1986. And he was questioning a group of students, some kids about your age maybe, even younger, some of them. And one of them pulled out a gun and shot him point blank. He didn't die, but he was paralyzed. Several of the bullets lodged in his neck. He was paralyzed the rest of his life. He had to breathe through a ventilator. While he was lying in hospital recovering, he decided to forgive this young man who shot him. And he actually later reached out to him and they talked. And he said, here's a quote from him: "Had I not forgiven anger, bitterness, and hatred, that would have killed me." And that's the thing. If we have anger inside of us, it does a lot of damage to us. Science will tell us that. And so forgiveness is not a religious thing. It's a tool that everybody can use to let go of anger and bitterness and move forward. That's why it's so important. So that they started this program of speaking stories of forgiveness to students in high schools. And some of those stories you'll hear today. So let me introduce the speakers. We'll be hearing from Randy Kelder, there's a picture of her brother Ryan here, who died of a drug overdose. And that's a big problem, drugs and alcohol, that is violence. So you'll hear from Randy first, and then later you'll hear from Patrick and Anne-Marie DeLiso. Their son Pat was a popular athlete, student in high school, but he had undiagnosed depression, and he died of suicide. And that's another tragedy that is growing in our society, often due to pressures that many of you face, pressures of bullying, angry words, social media. So those are the kinds of things that we'll talk about and how to combat that. So let's hear from Randy first. Randy will tell her story, and thank you for welcoming her.